Look, it really is a great pleasure to be able to, or have the honour of introducing Joe to you today to deliver the keynote address. Now, Joe is the federal member for North Sydney and was first elected to the Australian Parliament in 1996. Following his re-election in 1998, he was made Minister for Financial Services and Regulation. He has since held a number of ministerial portfolios, including small business and tourism, and I like the tourism one, Joe, human services and employment and workplace relations. Following the 2007 federal election, Joe held a number of senior shadow ministry portfolios before being appointed Shadow Treasurer in February of 2009. In September 2013, Joe was sworn in as Treasurer of the Commonwealth of Australia by Her Excellency as part of a newly elected coalition government. Now, prior to entering politics, Joe was a banking and finance lawyer with a major Australian law firm. He was also a Director of Policy to the Premier of New South Wales. Joe is married with 3 young children. Now, so that you can prepare yourselves, Joe will speak for 15 minutes and then he's going to take 15 minutes of questions from the floor. 15 minutes of questions, so that means the questions need to be short and sharp, to the point, so think about it as we go along. You're not the star, Joe is, so like I said, keep the questions short and sharp, short answers. Thank you very much. Would you please welcome the Treasurer, the Honourable Joe Hockey. Thank you.
Well, Bob, thank you so much. For about 5 minutes there, I was thinking to myself, oh my God, he's going to say what I said. It was a rather explicit and direct instruction not to screw up, but not in those words. And let me say to you, Bob, that Cairns has performed magnificently in its role as host of the G20, and I absolutely... You know, it is no surprise to me because it is my second home, particularly the Tablelands, and I have a great and deep fondness for Cairns and for far north Queensland, so I knew you'd deliver, and you have, and the fact that we have most of the G20 coming here to Cairns, and it's only been elections or rather unseemly referendums that have held some back, I'd say to you it has already been judged a raging success. And I thank you for your hospitality, but most importantly, for the community engagement and the warm welcome. It really has been exceptional. Can I properly recognise my good friend Tim Nichols, who is here, Treasurer of Queensland, doing an outstanding job. Also Senator McLucas, who's there, Jan McLucas, and there are a number of others. The member for Barron, Michael Trout, I didn't see where Michael is, but he's somewhere here. Dr Parkinson, the Secretary of the Treasury, who's done a great job. And particularly to you, Sandra, thank you so much for hosting me here, and the very warm welcome I received outside as well. They don't protest the way I used to, obviously. Perhaps they're a little more sober these days than I was. But and all the regional councillors and many other distinguished guests, including former Treasurer Keith DeLacy and, of course, my old mate Warren Mundine, who's here. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here to talk a bit about tropical economies. And far north Queensland is a unique part of the globe. It is, of course, the only place that I can think of where 2 World Heritage listed icons meet together, the wet tropics rainforest and the Great Barrier Reef. And it's where diverse climates and environments coexist. Tropical islands, inhabited and many uninhabited, are dotted throughout the Great Barrier Reef, which was described to me the other day as larger than the country of Italy in scale. And this region has pioneered tropical agricultural production techniques, amongst many other things, and including, of course, the original research for sugar production and other tropical products going way back to the 1890s. North Queensland produces 1 in 10 of Australia's agricultural production dollars, including 90% of the nation's bananas, and how we recall the impact on the cost of bananas throughout Australia with Cyclone Larry in particular. You produce half of Australia's mangoes, 94% of our sugar, and almost all our pineapples and lychees and many other things. And it's the food supply up here that will help to meet the demand, the massive growing demand coming out of Asia's rapidly expanding middle class over the next few years, which currently stands at about 600 million people. And of course, Cairns is widely recognised as a centre of excellence for the management of tropical diseases as well. The Australian Institute of Tropical Health and Medicine, based here at James Cook University, recently received $42 million from the government to advance that specialist research. And that was one of our election commitments, which we've delivered in full. There's vast resources here in relation to tropical economic activity. And it stretches from healthcare, as I said, the testing of novel drugs and treatments, right through to the massive innovation in the tourism industry. And as my parliamentary secretary who is here, Steve Chobo, who knows a lot more about the tourism industry than I've ever known, even though I was Minister for Tourism. He is a Mareeba boy originally. He knows that this part of the world offers unique tourism experiences that in many ways are world-class and in many other areas actually more innovative than anything else in the world. So we have much to teach others. Part of that is related to the fact that we have been here a long time, and as a sophisticated community, as a community that has met head-on all types of different adversity, you've been able to develop and innovate new techniques, new initiatives that help to see you through the various climate changes that we experience, from severe weather like cyclones right through to extreme heat. And that's reflected in everything from, obviously, building codes, where the innovation here and also in Darwin is world-class, through to better energy efficiency, better use of energy, which, of course, is hugely important in energy-sapping tropical climates. So with finance ministers and central bank governors from around the world converging on Cairns over these few days, we have a terrific opportunity to start a new dialogue in relation to tropical economies. Now, I understand that Tim Nichols a little bit earlier talked about the unique circumstances of tropical economies. I understand he mentioned the elements of population, participation and productivity in determining the growth of such economies. He also talked about Queensland's broader expertise in making the most of its tropical growth opportunities. So I want to give you a bit of an overview of some of the opportunities we have in linking it with the G20 activities this week. Nearly half of all G20 members are located completely or partially in the tropics. So the G20 ministers meeting over the next few days represent 85% of the world economy. 85% of the world economy. And I say again, nearly half of all G20 members are located completely or partially in the tropics. And as we know, the tropical region includes some of the world's most populous and, most importantly, rapidly expanding societies. I understand Sandra told me that she talked a little bit about that growth earlier. As you would be well aware, the recent State of the Tropics report showed that since the 1980s, tropical economies, when taken together, have averaged higher annual growth than the rest of the world. But the report also noted that tropical economies face significant challenges. There are threats to environmental sustainability, there's a need for improved healthcare and education, and of course there are substantial risks to growth. So these challenges also present opportunities. I never see a challenge that I don't want to meet and exceed, and I'm sure that you're the same. So when we work through the challenges for tropical economies in partnership with the goals of the G20, which I'd like to talk to today, you can see some synergies that are important. The focus of the G20 meeting this week will unquestionably be, how do we keep focusing on growth and jobs? When I took over the presidency of the G20 finance ministers and central bank governors at the beginning of this year, after consulting with a number of different finance ministers who had been through the global financial crisis, there was perhaps a sense of pessimism and exhaustion in the G20. Pessimism about the failure of the global economy to recover as fast as one would have expected after such a severe downturn, but also a level of exhaustion that a lot of the finance ministers and central bank governors have been there through the incredible gyrations of the global financial crisis, that engaged in so many sophisticated responses to what was a very different environment, and therefore they were exhausted. And I resolved with a number of them, privately and then publicly at our first meeting in Sydney, that instead of focusing on the glass being half empty, we'd work on how to make sure that the world saw the glass being half full. In fact, we wanted to fill it. And therefore we had to change the dialogue, move it away from the traditional dialogue about more regulation and higher taxes to get into a focus on more growth and more jobs. And for the first time in the history of the G20, after quite an eventful series of bilateral discussions and then a robust discussion in the room in Sydney, we said we want to increase global growth by an additional 2% to 2018. It's a big call. Global growth. And we actually put a number on it, which is unprecedented. A lot of these communiques, some of them go on and on and on out of these meetings, and you wouldn't believe the amount of negotiation that goes into these communiques. Seriously, it is quite extraordinary. But I said the golden rule that I gave was communique can't be more than 2 pages long, and it's got to have something that is identifiable as a benchmark. And out of that, setting a benchmark, as you've set benchmarks here in Cairns and far north Queensland, and as Tim is setting a benchmark for Queensland more generally, we said, OK, we're going to go for 2%. That means growing the economy by an additional $2 trillion to 2018, up to 20 million new jobs. 20 million new jobs. Sounds like a hell of a lot. It is a hell of a lot. Although, having said that, as the Finance Minister of China said, he has to create 13 million new jobs every year to keep China going. And as I responded, it took us 200 years to create 13 million jobs. But the fact is, we had to lay down our plans for growth. We each had to submit new initiatives that were going to deliver the structural reforms to grow the global economy, because budgetary policy, fiscal policy, is essentially exhausted. Governments around the world have effectively run out of money. Therefore, you can't throw money to stimulate the economies, and whether it's the federal government in Australia, state government or even the local government here in Cairns, governments have essentially run out of money and just can't throw money at attempts to stimulate growth. And of course, monetary policy is it's not at its weakest, but it certainly is not at its absolute capacity. And the fact is that monetary policy is more accommodative now generally than at almost any other time. In the United States, even though it is continuing with tapering, is heading in a slightly different direction, or obviously a different direction, to Europe and Japan. And only this week, China decided to give in excess of $80 billion to its major banks to try and get its economy going. Well, the fact is that monetary policy no longer has the capacity to deliver the growth that people would have expected, and fiscal policy no longer has that capacity. So how are we going to grow the economy when you've got fiscal consolidation and tightening of monetary policy? the two most obvious levers? Well, the only way to do it is with structural reform. And structural reform is hard, especially when a government undertakes it by its own. And therefore, we need air cover, and the air cover is the G20. The air cover is that every nation on earth with a significant economy has signed up to a reform program that means that we're going to have to do the things necessary within our own economies and across economies in order to build growth and create jobs. That means pushing for trade liberalisation rather than increasing trade protection. It means improving our competitive business environments rather than having redundant or even obsolete competition laws. It means freeing up taxation systems with less tax overall, simplified taxation systems, but also fairer taxation systems, and that's one of the things we're focusing on this weekend. It means freeing up the labour markets and, importantly, facilitating the travel of workers across jurisdictions. It also obviously means that we've got to work harder in a range of other areas, including supporting innovation and, importantly, ground-up policies such as the development of a tropical economy plan that is going to help to facilitate the growth that we need. So therefore it is hugely important when you focus on growth that you search out every possible area that provides opportunity. A key part of that is innovation, and part of innovation is about using the tools that are available to you better. And in Australia we've got a great tool, and that is the structure of our nation. The geographical, the climate differences across our nation provide us with opportunities to better understand the diversity of the global economy, the challenges in the global economy, but also, particularly in this case, to focus on opportunities associated with a tropical climate. So that's why today's discussion is hugely important. There is going to be other discussion at the G20 because we need to make sure that our systems are robust, as I said a little bit earlier. We've got to focus on taxation and making sure that those companies that earn tax in a jurisdiction pay tax in a jurisdiction. No single country can fire a bullet that is going to ensure that multinationals pay tax in their jurisdiction. It needs to be a coordinated approach. And over the last few months in particular, the OECD has been working on a base erosion plan, profit shifting, it's known as BEPS, base erosion and profit shifting plan, so that hopefully this weekend G20 finance ministers will sign up to an agreed global approach to ensure that companies pay tax where they earn money. That's not an easy outcome, but we're going to work damn hard at it. And the other area which is hugely important is that we have common reporting standards, and that is that we ensure that where bank accounts are opened, there is a consistent collection of information, and the bank accounts, wherever they may be located, are made available to taxation commissioner equivalents or tax authorities so that they can know if people are hiding money in other jurisdictions. It sounds easy, setting up consistent reporting mechanisms, but it's damn hard. Millions of accounts are opened every day around the world, and trying to get consistent information gathering and get systems that talk to each other is very difficult. But Australia is absolutely determined to be involved in that. And then the other area of activity which adds to the robustness of the world economy is to finalise the priorities of the Financial Stability Board. Now, the Financial Stability Board is basically the major central bankers and prudential supervisors of the world gathering in the one place to determine what the rules are for banking and prudential supervision of financial institutions, and also the financial markets generally. That's chaired by Mark Carney, who's the Governor of the Bank of England, who was here yesterday but has gone back to the UK today for the Scottish referendum result. But I can say to you in my discussions with him yesterday, we believe that at the G20 we can sign off on a number of initiatives that are going to ensure that that banks that fail in the future are going to be held responsible for their own failure, and systemically important banks don't have to turn to governments to be bailed out, essentially taxpayers. We also hope to finalise the rules in relation to shadow banking, which is an issue that, there's shadow banking here in Australia, but more particularly it's in China and a range of other jurisdictions, and represents a potential significant threat to the stability of the global financial system. Other areas which are a little bit harder to deal with involve over-the-counter derivatives regulation, and that will be a bit more difficult than some of the others. But fundamentally, we are going to nail the key priorities of financial regulation and ensure we can bring to a close a lot of the over-regulation that was so tempting for many legislators and regulators as a result of the global financial crisis. Now, why is that important to you? Well, because fundamentally it affects everyone. It affects everyone. If you've got a robust, transparent taxation system, it ensures governments get the money that is able to facilitate the delivery of essential public services. If you've got a robust financial system, then you can start to argue the case as to why there should be better access to credit, particularly for small businesses, particularly for farmers in this part of Northern Australia. But also, when you search for growth, it means you have to work harder with the tools you have, as I said a little bit earlier, and that provides opportunity, particularly in relation to tropical economies. Now, this government is absolutely determined to focus on opportunities in Northern Australia. That's why we initiated a Northern Australia white paper, and importantly, the local member here, Warren Ench, has chaired a parliamentary committee that has fed a lot of information through to that. I can say to you that the Northern Australia white paper will not hesitate to be bold. It won't hesitate to be bold. And importantly, it is a long-term plan for the region. I think there is a consensus view throughout Australia that there is massive opportunity in Northern Australia, but we simply haven't taken advantage of it over the years. And obviously, Cairns and Far North Queensland have a prominent role to play. Obviously, we can get to questions covering these sorts of issues, but I want to thank you for a number of things. Firstly, thank you for holding this important conference, focusing on an area of great opportunity for Australia. Secondly, thank you for being such generous hosts for the G20 and the finance ministers this week. A number of finance ministers I've spoken to already are just really enjoying the weather, which Bob assures me he's turned on for everyone. And when I spoke to George Osborne last night, I pointed out that I was sitting on a balcony having a beer, and it was about 28 degrees, and he reflected that he was sitting in Downing Street and it was getting a little bit cold, and he was a long way from a beer. He would obviously have loved to have been here, but having the world's major finance ministers here and central bank governors is great credit to Cairns. It's a credit to Australia's leadership, and I thank you for being a part of that journey, and I wish you good luck over the weeks and months ahead. Thanks very much. Hello, Kerry.
Hello, me. Now, I won't start the questions unless there isn't one. Okay, we've got one right in the front.
Thanks, Kerry. Mark Matthews, Advanced Cairns. Joe, some of the reform measures you mentioned are politically difficult. How will you inspire Australia and Australians to take a leadership role in this reform?
Well, we have no choice here. We have to earn growth. The world has to earn growth, and Australia is no different. And I suppose necessity is going to be a part of that story. We have a number of initiatives that are coming through the pipeline: taxation white paper, federation white paper, competition policy review. In the next few months we'll release an intergenerational report which will provide some guidance on how big the structural challenges are for Australia. And out of that, we'll take the nation on a journey to fully explain how in partnership with the community we can meet those challenges head on. And yes, some of them will be very difficult, but you know, nothing comes easily anymore. Nothing comes easily anymore.
Another question? Over here.
Hugh Mackay from Westpac.
Hugh,
Hugh Mackay from Westpac. Now, Australia has an arguably overvalued exchange rate, an investor boom in housing and record low interest rates. Other countries facing this dilemma have turned to macroprudential policy. What is the government's attitude towards macroprudential?
Well, the starting point is I'm not going to opine on the Australian dollar. I think a mug does that. As for property prices, there are quite clearly significant property value increases in parts of Sydney, parts of Melbourne, and to some degree in Brisbane. But I think you know, obviously the Reserve Bank will look at some of the macroprudential issues that you're referring to or you're alluding to. Having said that, I don't think we should be in the business of panic. We should just be measured in our response to some of the challenges that we face, work them through, but also explain to the community why they're being undertaken. I don't readily accept the suggestion that if there is a boom, that government needs to step in immediately to try and control the speed of that boom. Hopefully you will see an increase in supply in relation to housing that will help to address that. Also in other areas, you know, the Australian dollar is what it is. I mean, markets are markets, and when governments interfere either on the downside or the upside, it distorts a market. And if you believe in markets and freedom of commerce, you should be very wary about getting directly involved.
Any other questions? Yes, sure, we've got quite a few. We'll take right in the middle here. At the microphone over. Thanks.
Hello. Yep. Mr. Treasurer, recently we've seen the Murray inquiry into the banking system. There's been some talk about different methods of basically bailing the banks out should they fail. We have taxpayer-funded or depositor-funded methods. What about the old system they used in America after the last Depression, back in the 30s? The Glass-Steagall Act, where we separate the banks? What's your view on this?
Well, look, I think it is important that banks have the appropriate levels of capital to be able to deal with unexpected events. I think it's also important that we regularly stress test our banks, which is exactly what is happening on a regular basis out of APRA. And one of the reasons why I reacted to the suggestion that Australian banks are too exposed to the residential property market at a meeting a little bit earlier in the week was because that becomes a bit of a mantra for some critics of the Australian banking system. And it is essentially unfounded that the suggestion that they have excessive exposure to the residential property market. And the stress testing undertaken by APRA suggests that it would be an extreme event that would cause grave concern about the capital adequacy of major Australian banks in the event of a residential property crisis. So Australian banks are well capitalised. They are very well managed in my view, and we should be happy to have a well capitalised and well managed banking system, because quite obviously we've seen what a poorly capitalised and poorly managed banking system could look like during the GFC. Now, the Murray inquiry is endeavouring to resolve some of the definitional differences between the banks and APRA on capital adequacy, and we'll leave them to sort that out. I asked them to sort that out. And really, before I get the Murray inquiry provided to me, I'd like David Murray and his committee, together with the banks, to sort out what the appropriate definitions are for capital adequacy that comply with Basel III. What am I getting at? I don't see a return to the 1930s as a particularly good policy initiative. Banks are very different today. Financial institutions more generally are very different. And I think we should remain vigilant about our banking system, but not be overly concerned, given that overall the global banking system has come through enormous challenges over the last few years. And while some of those challenges remain, particularly in relation to European banks, the system overall has survived and probably will be far more robust as a result of that.
Question? Yes?
Mr. Treasurer.
Sorry, why didn't I address Glass-Steagall? Because I was there when Graham Leach-Bliley Act was introduced in Washington. So that's quite a heated debate in the US at the moment about whether Glass-Steagall should be dusted off and brought back. Sorry.
Mr. Treasurer, my name is Alex Duval. I'm the CEO of Tourism Tropical North Queensland.
Good on you.
And first of all, I want to thank you very much for your role in bringing the G20, obviously, to this wonderful part of the world.
Well, I do give credit to my predecessors. Am I allowed to do that?
Yes, you are.
I do give credit because, Kevin Rudd did get the G20 and for Australia. It's very expensive, though, but he did get it.
Well, we appreciate the expense
and I'm
glad it came. In this
I'm
region.
very glad it came here.
I've also got a number of very excited staff at the moment that have been looking after the head of the IMF, Christine Lagarde, in our Visitor Information Centre. So it's wonderful to have, again, these types of individuals experiencing this fantastic part of the world. Just given, obviously, your background, the tourism background in particular, and now moving into the broader economic profile, what do you see as the prospects for this region relative, if you like, to the rest of the economy and perhaps to the rest of Australia? How do you see Cairns and Great Barrier Reef positioned?
From a tourism perspective, I mean, you'll continue to see growth. Obviously, inbound Chinese tourism is a new opportunity. I think, look, there's lessons to be learned. I don't want to, revisit my days, no matter how happy they were as Minister for Tourism. But I think you've got to be careful about reaching out for volume over yield. There's a danger that you can go high volume, low yield in tourism. And you've got to get the balance right, and Australia is not a high-volume destination, and it shouldn't try and make itself a high-volume destination. It should focus on improving the yield, and when people travel a fair distance to come here, spend more time travelling around. Therefore, you've got to encourage them to take the opportunity associated with diverse experiences. So I said to a lot of the finance ministers, I'd love you to go to the reef, but it'd be terrific if you also went to the rainforest and maybe even went out back. Now, they're time poor, but maybe, just maybe, we can get a couple of them out to the reef. And I think a few of them are going to go and visit the rainforest and various other things. So the world is increasingly made up of people that are time poor, and particularly higher income people are usually time poor unless they're grey nomads. So what we've got to do is make sure that the experience meets their expectations, even exceeds their expectations. The final thing I'd say is you constantly need to put pressure on hotel operators to upgrade accommodation. And I think Australia generally has, over the last few years, missed out on a wave of investment in accommodation, primarily because we've had a very high Australian dollar and it's been very hard to justify increasing expenditure on upgrading accommodation. But I'm actually quite confident that we're going to see a surge in renovations and also, importantly, a surge in new accommodation around the region.
One more question? We'll take it from over here if we've... Bob's got the microphone.
Mr. Treasurer, given your last comment, I take it then that you would be subject to due process. You'd see the Aquis Quaker Barrier Reef Resort as satisfying that balance of yield and volume.
Well, look, I think it'd be terrific.
You want a bit of time with this one?
I think it'd be terrific for Cairns to have a project like that underway. Yorkie Snob hasn't seen anything quite like that, and certainly on that scale. And I think, look, we should do everything we can to help to facilitate it. It's got to go through the appropriate probity checks. I think that's hugely important because there's reputational risk all round, and we don't want to be seen as a, destination for anyone other than the most honest and trustworthy individuals operating casino licences, wherever they are in Australia. I'm not passing judgment on the applicant there. The other thing is I would want to make sure that there is local benefit. Now, Bob, you'd have a better understanding of that than me, but and I know it happened a bit in the past where you had, inbound travellers who would land on, their own domiciled aircraft and get into their own domiciled buses and go out to their own domiciled hotels and have their own domiciled duty-free shops and then reverse the process. But I'd like to make sure, I would encourage that there be deep community involvement in the project. Now, that's without passing judgment on the project, but I think there needs to be deep community involvement in the project. I wouldn't like to see a raft of working visas going towards a project without local job creation on a sustained basis, and engagement more generally with the local community, so that it isn't just about tourists staying in the one facility, but that they actually do experience all the other benefits of the region so that we can maximise the economic benefit of the project. Having said that, don't take any of that as a criticism or endorsement of the project.
Last question. What would you regard as your biggest achievement in your first 100 days?
Back to my first 100, can I go 300? 350 days? Look,
your first year.
First year, look, there's a number of things, Kerry. I mean, it all sounds a bit self-indulgent, but the fact is we've delivered what we promised. We said that we would get rid of the carbon tax, and we've delivered. We said we'd get rid of the mining tax, we've delivered. We said that we would end the age of entitlement, but make sure you've got a strong and robust safety net in place for those most vulnerable and those most needy. And we've started that process, but it also applies to business. And some of the hardest decisions we made were in the first 100 days, where we said to the car manufacturers and SPC and others, and even Qantas, sorry guys, enough. We can't keep writing out cheques from other Australians to help you continue with your business. And I think we haven't received enough credit for the significance of that decision, because it has led to some cultural change in the attitudes of business in Australia. I inherited 93 announced but unlegislated taxation changes going back to 2001. And when I asked the Treasury to explain to me some of those changes, they couldn't, because no one was there when they were announced. So they didn't know what the intent was before when they made the announcement. So we cleaned the slate. And we said we'd collect less tax than what our predecessors would have collected, and we did in the budget. Despite the deficit reduction levy and a range of other things, we actually collect less tax now as a result of our decisions than would have been collected if Labor were re-elected. And I think we've provided stability and certainty, and that's given people the confidence to start going for growth. It's hard to get the tortoise to take its head out of the shell, right, occasionally. I mean, it gets a little spooked. But the fundamentals are right. We have created an environment where jobs are being created. And it's not often I get a Dorothy Dixer from you, that's why I'm continuing. But
you're going to respect that by making it brief.
Yeah, I'll make it brief from now on. But, every month this year, the community, have created 3 times the number of jobs, 15 on average, more than 15,000 a month, excluding last month's extraordinary number. 15,000 new jobs a month every month in Australia this year, compared to 5,000 a month last year. So we're getting there. And the budget, of course, we're trying to get under control. We're getting there, but, there's much work to be done. We haven't finished. And finally, given that you gave me the opportunity, Kerry, and this is the first time you've ever given it to me, especially without interrupting. Unlike your successor who tried to interrupt me last night. I know.
You're pushing it.
But the big thing that I think hasn't been properly recognised is the scale of our infrastructure program. And in partnership with the state governments, we are building with the private sector 8 snowy mountain schemes in the next 6 years in Australia. It took 2 decades to build the Snowy Mountain Scheme. We're building the equivalent of 8 of them in additional new infrastructure in Australia. Additional new infrastructure in Australia in just the next 6 years. And that program's going to roll out. So, these are all about building the future, and that's what's exciting. That's what's exciting. Might bring you back to the 7:30.
Quit while you're ahead.
Good on you. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Joe Hockey. For joining us, and we know this must be a particularly busy time for you with the G20 coming up and so on. So I'm sure everyone here appreciates that you've taken the time.